Thank you for joining us. This is Minnesota Atheists TV. My name is Mahad Mohammad. Today's topic will be Dungeons and Dragons, or D&D. Today we're talking with our guests Hertz and Daniel Hansen about perhaps arguably the first role-playing game in 1974, Dungeons and Dragons. A game that offers a wild romp of imaginations. Was it a game of pastime for teenagers who indulged in hanging out while they waited for their pizza delivery? Or as evangelists saw it, a game that is a front for demon worship? It also has opened the gates of hell and has seduced millions of kids. And a couple of those two kids in the 1980s are Daniel Hansen and Hertz. So let's talk to them. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
Thank you for having us.
Has it been long since you two have played D&D?
Admittedly, it has been a while, though granted, I didn't really play in the 80s. I started playing probably around 2004, 2005.
Okay. How about you, Dan?
I started in, I think it was 85 or 86, and it's been about 2 weeks since I played.
Okay. Either one of you own any of the editions?
I own almost all of 4th edition.
Okay.
I have first edition, second edition, and 5th edition. I kind of went on a break for a while and skipped the 3rd and 4th. But yeah, and I have a copy of my first edition here, which I've had now for over 30 years.
It's looking like it.
And it's had a lot of love and use. So I doubt I'll ever play that edition again, but you just can't get rid of it. So
it's awesome.
Too many memories.
What is D&D?
Dungeons and Dragons, it's what's called a role-playing game where you get to immerse yourself into a character. It's kind of like acting light. Mm-hmm. You get to play this character. It started in 1974 by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, and it's kind of taken off from there.
Yeah. What was the reason for the game?
Well, originally the game started out as a form of war games, which were done, I think, primarily in England at the beginning. And yep. these people would get together and they would role play these characters and these battles and kind of see what would have happened if the tactics had been changed, etc. And so there was a lot of rules involved in it. And then it kind of morphed into this idea of a single player. Like, what if you were just a single person in that battle? And then Gary Gygax, like you said, and Arneson both kind of took a hold of this idea and created Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah. Did you want to say something, Hertzy?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. How many versions are there, or how many editions of the game exist today?
Technically, there's 5. They've announced 5th edition, but there's also you have to include like 3.5, and there's Advanced D&D and Advanced D&D 2.
And that's original D&D before AD&D.
Exactly. Okay. And that's just Dungeons and Dragons. Role-playing has branched out all over. You have games like Shadowrun, which takes place in the near future. You have games that are copycats of D&D, like Castles and Crusaders. And I mean, it just goes on and on and on. Okay. There's a plethora of role-playing games out there now. Okay.
And there's a lot of also in society too. It's kind of insinuated itself in a way that most people wouldn't even be aware of. Like, if you think about improv, like improvisational theater, that's really a form of role playing. You're given a character, you're given a time, a situation, and then you play that character. All that started with role playing, and all that kind of started with the big bad boy Dungeons and Dragons.
Is it a single player? How many players can you play within a single game?
So games can last a long time. I was in a game that lasted probably about 4 years, and within that, I actually only played 2 characters, but I probably could have switched out characters almost every few months if I really felt like doing the work for it.
Could you technically play with 2 players then?
You could.
Okay.
You could.
Yeah.
There's a fair amount to keep track of. The way the game works is you have a primary person who creates the world and creates the setting. He's the story, or she's the storyteller. And they're called the Dungeon Master or the DM. Then you have however many players they want to invite into their world, and those are the players that comprise it, that he explains the world to in the situations, and they make their decisions on what they want to do in that world.
Okay. So the Dungeon Master basically controls the story and the characters, and it's sort of this travel through imaginary world controlled by the DM then.
The DM controls all the characters that are not played by players. Anybody who is what's called a player character, they get to control their character. It's the only thing the DM can't control. And that in and of itself can be hilarious, because you can take your character off into way left field and throw the DM off their game.
Okay. So practically the DM, the Dungeon Master role then would be sort of a referee and a storyteller in a way then.
Right, and he or she plays all the other characters in the world except for the people that are actually there.
Okay. Okay. What are any major differences between the editions in terms of the storyline, or characters?
In Dungeons & Dragons specifically, I think they keep a lot of the same ideas for their worlds. The thing is, with Dungeons & Dragons, it's always a creative process, so characters are usually the player's own creation, and the worlds can often be the DM's creation. So it's mostly the rule changes.
It's mechanics more than anything that change.
Yeah, I would say things like, how certain spells work are tweaked between different editions, and that's mostly it.
Well, I grew up playing sports games, sort of the Madden and NBA. But the longest game I've ever played again was D&D, and it took nearly 8 months on the campaign that I was on. So it technically, like you said, the one that you were on took months. I don't know how long.
The one I'm in, I've been playing for over a year right now.
Over a year.
Yeah.
And that's typical for the game.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, for a good campaign.
Yeah. Do you guys use the same characters? Do you change characters? What are the characters like?
I think to a certain extent, you play characters that you're interested in playing, and that may be because they're like yourself in some ways, and so you imagine yourself in this situation. Or sometimes, with any sort of role playing, you want to play something that's different than you, and it's an easy way to do that. There is something called LARP, which you're more acquainted with than I am, but LARPing, which I don't know if you want to explain what that is a little.
LARPing is live action role playing. The biggest difference between tabletop role playing, which is what D&D is, and LARPing is, instead of saying, I get up and I walk out the door, you just literally get up and walk out the door. So in some ways it's a little simplified, because you have a designated area that you're playing, and you can move around freely within that area. But you still have a lot of the same rules. Combat is done, with, let's see, when I played Vampire the Masquerade, we actually used rock, paper, scissors.
Okay.
So it's very it's similar to that. So it's like, okay, now we got to do rock, paper, scissors. All right, ready? Dun, 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 dun.
Do you usually roll the dice, and that determines maybe what type of character that you get to choose?
Sometimes it's
depends.
It's with what the DM is looking for, because he's created this world, and he knows it, kind of what sort of a party would work best.
Yep.
If you're in a world that primarily is going to be focused on with characters that are of different races, like elves or whatever, and they'll have to deal with situations like that, then he may push you towards a certain thing. It's like, well, your party really needs a thief. You're going to need somebody who's got these abilities, or so usually it's with the DM, a choice that's made.
Yeah. I remember actually there was one game I played. It wasn't Dungeons & Dragons. It was a variant. And I think one of the things you might have had to roll for was your some of the things within your class and such. And I was just like, this is an amazing amount of rolling for this. Can't I just say, this is my character and I'm done?
Right. Yeah. And the LARPing you talked about earlier is sort of where certain characters then put on customs and you know, these goofy customs, and do they act it out then in character as well?
Right, sort of like the Renaissance Fair. If you've ever been to the Renaissance Fair, you'll see people that are in character, full gear, and they'll speak in a certain way, and they'll act as if there are certain, you know, personas, and that's a form of LARPing, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree.
Okay. And in terms of the rules then, how complex are the rules in terms of playing the game?
As a player, not that bad. As a dungeon master, there's a lot of rules.
Because you get to decide in terms of
right,
how
because you have to
the adventure
decide.
goes.
You know, when you're a kid and you role play and you play cops and robbers, and you know your friend shoots you, you just then have an argument about whether they hit you. When you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, you can try to shoot somebody, but then you actually have to roll dice to see whether you hit them, and whether you hit them depends on a lot of different factors that the DM has to keep track of.
Okay.
Did you ever play with Thaco?
No, I don't even know what you're talking about.
Was that one of the characters?
No, Thaco was, I want to say, first or second edition, and it was a way of determining whether or not somebody was hit. And apparently it was this amazingly complex thing. I have not played that edition.
Sounds horrible.
Yeah, it from what I've heard, it's terrible.
Okay. Okay. So there was an uptick in fundamentalist Christianity in the 1980s. The Reagan right had begun to dominate politics, and it was the beginning of a sort of a cultural war. The Parents Music Resource Center started to put labels on album covers to warn against profanity and even references to the occult. It was sort of a perfect ride for what was the 1980s satanic panic.
Right.
And wanted you guys to talk about maybe a little bit in terms of what the satanic ritual was about in the 1980s.
Well, it started in the 1972 with Mike Wernicke publishing his book, The Satan Seller, and then it kind of sort of started building from there in the next 8 years. In 1980s, Michelle Remembers came out, which was the first book about satanic ritual abuse.
And then a movie, I believe, also afterwards.
Oh, really? I did not know about the movie.
The Maces and Monsters?
Mason, oh yeah,
Yeah.
Mason, that came after though.
That was the...
In the 80s.
Yeah, that was also in the 80s. That was actually after the book Mazes and Monsters.
Okay, all right.
That's, but yeah, so Michelle Remembers came out, and that started the whole satanic ritual abuse, which, you know, started that train. But then alongside that came this Dungeons and Dragons, when I believe it was 1979 that Irving Egbert the third got lost in the steam tunnels trying to kill himself in Michigan University.
Okay. So let's tell our audience, maybe between the two stories, what exactly was the book Michelle Remembers about?
Michelle Remembers was about a woman who started using like a memory therapy with her psychiatrist, and it was basically helping her remember satanic rituals that were done with her mother. And it eventually was proven to be fraudulent, but by that time it was already a full panic. And
yeah,
it was a very popular book,
yeah.
and it kind of spawned all these I guess copycats, you want to say, or something like that, where people started thinking, well, something weird happened in my background, maybe too. So I think I'm going to go see a psychiatrist, and you know. And then suddenly you had this just kind of blowing up. I kind of think of it like Roswell and the UFOs, where you have one incident never proven to have happened, and then suddenly, you know, nobody's seeing UFOs before Roswell, and then suddenly everybody's seeing them, and they all kind of sound the same. Yeah. So, and that's kind of the way this happened.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that was a great point, because it was termed as a cutting edge psychotherapy in a lot of ways in terms of the book, because that was it brought to the forefront these repressed memories that these kids had through sexually who were abused sexually by, you know, demonic monsters who were people,
sacrifices
basically.
And
sacrifices
like
and rituals. Yeah.
And I think D&D then became a perfect scapegoat for it, because here was this new type of game, like role-playing games, and a lot of people didn't understand it. A lot of people still don't. That's why we just spent some time explaining it. You know, there was no board. There was, you know, just some books and paper and weird-looking dice that nobody had ever seen before, and you know, people decided, well, this looks really strange. You know, I don't understand what you're doing with your friends all day, because a lot of times you'll play for hours, and so, you know, you disappear with your friends with these weird books and dice and things, and it just was a natural fit, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Well, which brings up to the next question that I want to ask, which is how then D&D sort of got LARPed into the satanic occult, because you mentioned James Dallas Egbert III, and if you can elaborate a little bit on what happened, what that story is.
Yeah, it does. So James Egbert, just in 1979, he got lost in the steam tunnels of University of Michigan, like I said, and that was actually a suicide attempt. He then, after that, went to a friend's house for about a month. His mom, of course, freaked out, called in a private investigator who mentioned that Egbert played Dungeons and Dragons to the press, and kind of said, well, I think this might have something to do with it, and the press ran with it. They started going with this idea that, you know, oh, he was lost playing the game and such.
He confused reality with the game, and right.
Yep, and then he did eventually was found, but then later did commit suicide, unfortunately. And then Irving Pulling in 1982, I believe, ended up committing suicide, and his mother, Patricia Pulling, really went on a rampage against D&D. She actually tried to sue TSR and the high school principal. Both cases were dismissed, but she started this Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons group that would go to places like police stations and other, you know, court cases and such, and present themselves as experts on D&D.
And they would give talks in churches and things like that all the time too. They would, like religious schools would invite them in to talk about the evils and the dangers and things like that. So then you have this panic that starts to set in.
Yeah.
Well, and that was a good point in terms of what happened with James Dallas Egbert then, because the idea was that he actually disappeared while he was playing in the game, and somehow found himself in the game and was lost in those tunnels that are within the game itself.
Yep, and that was the inspiration for Monsters and Mazes.
Right.
Yep, that then was made into a very terrible movie.
Really?
Yes.
You've seen it?
With Tom Hanks.
That's right. It was one of Tom Hanks.
It was his first leading role, surprisingly, which a lot of people don't know.
Thankfully, he's done much better since then.
So much better.
Have you seen that movie?
I've seen parts of it. I couldn't spend that much time watching the entire thing.
And the movie was actually sort of loosely based on James Dallas Egbert III's story.
Extremely loose, because there's only like really 2 or 3 pieces that really, like, if you know the story of Egbert, you can connect.
Yeah.
But the rest of it was not.
Yeah.
You know, like what actually happens to Tom Hanks' character, definitely not what happened.
Yeah.
So
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was going to say, so you have this scenario where you have these groups primarily pushed by fundamentalist Christians, and the media grabs a hold of it. So you have these moral entrepreneurs, these people that are pushing to change the morality, to ban things or to promote things, and you have them pushing, and you have the media just buying into it completely, because it makes good copy. There were multiple shows and people that were buying into this in the mid '80s, 2020, 60 Minutes, Geraldo Rivera, and so suddenly it's all over your TV too, and so you don't know anything about it because you're a parent, you're looking at your kid and you don't know what they're doing, but on TV, it sure looks bad. So, you're hearing about, murders and rapes and all sorts of horrible things, and there you go.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's interesting because it's true though for the Christian conservative right. It was their way of saying maybe that America's kids are somehow ensnared in good versus evil.
Right.
But then at the same time you had heavy metal that was playing into it, horror music, Halloween, fantasy games, and then D&D just somehow happened to be there. And this was before rap music in the '90s came along. So.
Right.
It's
and
interesting.
violent video games, which,
right?
Was the next thing.
Yeah.
Right.
So.
Well, it's funny though because in 1981, then there were groups that were started in California and Utah that went as far as banning the game from public schools, where it was used for gifted students. So there have been many organizations that were involved, like you said, BAD and many others.
It's still banned in some prisons. To
this day?
Yeah, to this day.
They did it. They did that recently. They actually did. One of them was fairly recent. They thought it promoted gang activity.
Right. They didn't show how or anything, but because they're prisoners, they don't have a lot of say.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's the first time I've thought of geeks and gangs like really that close.
Yeah. Right. Well, just because I've seen, to go back to the movie, we were talking about Maces and Monsters. One of the things I didn't like about the movie was sort of this misgiving that you had that for Tom Hanks' character, that the game sort of meant abandonment of social interactions.
Right.
That the only way to get to adulthood was to sort of abandon the game. And that the game somehow offered these neurotic needs that were just unattainable.
All right.
Which is absolutely ridiculous because actually when I started playing, that helped me gain a whole group of friends. And then, now I do a bit more board games and such, which has hosted a whole new group of friends who I found. And, it's like gaming has gotten me more social interaction than almost anything else.
Right, and it plays to sort of this idea that I think we still, even today in 2016, we hold to it that, if you're, let alone a teenager playing the game, if you're an adult playing the game, you somehow don't have the ability to have social interaction, so that's all you know. You're basically, you haven't reached adulthood.
It seems like it's counterintuitive though, because there's over 6 million people who play Dungeons and Dragons occasionally, and 3 million that play on a monthly basis or more. That's a lot of people. That's, 6% of or whatever. I'm sorry for the math, but of the populace. So it seems like you'd hear about a lot more suicides and things if that was really the case.
Right.
Yeah.
And this wasn't just in the 1980s, even though most of the stuff happened in the late 70s, early 80s, and throughout the 80s with the fundamentalism that was happening, as you mentioned, with Pat Robertson and many others.
I think it probably went up until about 1995. I think was like when it finally started to die out. Which brings me into the next question of the West Memphis Three, the three kids in Arkansas, West Memphis, Arkansas. If you can talk a little bit about that case. Yeah, that was actually the case that got me started into looking into the whole satanic panic in general, because it was about somewhere between 2010 and 2012 that they finally were pardoned.
Of the accusations of
murder of 3 children who were 8 years old, which was startling for me because murders took place in 1993, which was about when I was 11. But they were charged with murder. They said that they did it in this satanic ritual, and that all the cuts and such were consistent with satanic ritual, and it was a very badly handled case that should never have gotten as far as it did.
Right. And it was pretty bad because the whole prosecution's their whole presentation of the case was that these were kids that wore black, listened to heavy metal, so therefore those two things on its own aren't necessarily a pretest to killing, you know,
Right.
8-year-olds, but
Right.
if you put all of it together,
Oh yeah. I actually read Devil's Knot, and they really had it out for Damien, specifically this juvenile. I want to say it was a juvenile probation officer who was assigned to Damien. I mean, he just, as soon as he heard that there was a murder in town, he went up to the guy and was like, "It was this kid," and they just went for it, despite the fact that there were other options available, including someone who supposedly had confessed, and they really wanted Damien and his 2 friends.
yeah.
I want to make a quick point, you know,
Yeah.
because there may be some question, you know, why is it still relevant? You know, it's the 80s or 90s, it's a long time ago, but it's still happening, and it's not necessarily happening with Dungeons and Dragons as much, but it's still happening. I know people personally who have had their parents, you know, not let them read the Harry Potter series, and one of them was kicked out of his house at 17 for reading a Harry Potter book. I know people that you know have had to hide like card games that might have spells in them or things like that. So the moral panic, the satanic panic, is still with us. It's shifted some, but it's still there.
Yeah.
And I think that's why looking back, it's important to understand how this came about.
Yeah.
And that's a great point, because I personally have had a personal experience where there's this shelter, and I will let it be unnamed, in the city, in Minneapolis, literally in the heart of the city, where I volunteered, and they usually accept toys of all sorts and whatnot, and somehow they've changed, and this is a private funded shelter, so they don't take any money specifically from the state, even though they do get money from the state. Have gone out of their way to make sure that they are not accepting any Harry Potter toys or clothing, and SpongeBob.
SpongeBob.
Yeah.
Yep, because SpongeBob, there was a big thing about SpongeBob being gay.
Yep.
Missed it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, the panics are there, they just spike and drop.
Yep.
They spike it like Ernie and Bert from
Yeah.
Sesame Street, where
It's all the
that was
fear
another
and
one.
again of not understanding
Yeah,
something.
yeah. We have a minute. Thank you both for coming in. You both are members of Godless Gamers and Players Without Prayers.
Yes, Godless Gamers. We meet on Thursday evenings and Sunday afternoons, 6 o'clock on Thursday and 2 o'clock on Sunday. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you both for coming in. This has been very fascinating. This is the Minnesota Atheist newsletter. It is dedicated to building positive atheist community that actively promotes secular values through educational programs, social activities, and participation in public affairs. Please go to minnesotaatheist.org for any questions you might have.